Welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of the major developments in the week in North Carolina politics and public policy. I'm Mitch Kokai, sitting in for Donna King, and we're joined by a star-studded cast once again this week. I'll introduce to you first Donald Bryson, who is the CEO of the John Locke Foundation. And I don't just say good things about him because he's my boss, but he is. And he is joined by Brooke Medina, who is the vice president of the John Locke Foundation. We are also joined by Alex Baltziger, who covers the General Assembly for Carolina Journal and has been busy despite the fact that the General Assembly hasn't been busy over the past few weeks. And we're joined for the first time by Anna Bevan-Gravely, who is executive director of the North Carolina FreeEnterprise Foundation, also known as NC Free. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and we hope you'll enjoy this very interesting and topical episode. Well, first we're going to start with the legislature, as we typically do, and after a few weeks of apparent inaction, we actually got some good news about a potential budget deal during the past week. Some good news coming from State Senate Leader Phil Berger and House Speaker Tim Moore. Alex, sounds like we might be close to a deal.
It sounds like we're getting close, and I think Senator Berger and Speaker Tim Moore agreed on some of the big issues that had been holding them up from sort of coming to a larger agreement. And I think they are still working out some of the more minor things, but some of the big things like the tax package, the Senate had wanted a pretty aggressive accelerated tax package for cutting personal income taxes, and the House had wanted to attach some triggers onto those tax cuts. And it sounds like they basically both got sort of what they wanted, came to some sort of agreement there. There will be triggers. I don't know exactly what the triggers look like, but the Senate was willing to agree to them. So we'll see what happens with the budget stuff, but we're starting to hear we might end up towards the back end of August when they come to a final agreement on the budget.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see. We have not yet seen this final deal that's being worked out. Donald, as someone who follows this very closely, what do you hope is in or not in the final budget?
Sure. So as Alex alluded to, I'm hoping there's some income tax cuts. We know that corporate tax cuts will not be part of the overall budget because they are already phasing those out. That's already part of law. They don't have to pass more legislation of that. And so that will be great that we get rid of the corporate income tax. The debate between the House and the Senate was about aggressively lowering down and maybe phasing out, but at least lowering the personal income tax rate, which is a flat rate in North Carolina. I'm curious to see what this revenue trigger deal is and how deep the tax are going to go. Or how deep the cuts are going to go. We don't really know. We don't have any detail. We just know they agreed on something. So we'll see, which highlights something that the John Locke Foundation has talked about for a long time, that these conference committees should have some meetings in public so that we can know what they're talking about rather than 6 people sitting in a closed room. One thing that we do know will be in there, because the House passed independent legislation and the Senate put it in the same budget, is universalizing the Opportunity Scholarship Program, which provides school choice to every school-age kid, regardless of where they already go to school in North Carolina, regardless of income level. They will be eligible for an Opportunity Scholarship. And that's a very big deal, and that'll make North Carolina the 7th or 8th state to pass a universal school choice program.
Those are good things. I know one thing you've been watching for in the budget is this NC Innovation.
Right, NC Innovation, which is a program that is good in scope. And the idea is to take applied research at North Carolina's universities and figure out how to get it across what they call the Valley of Death, so that the people who invent these things or whatever can get them to market. The problem is that they want to, the initial proposal of the Senate was about $1.4 billion in taxpayer money to prop up this nonprofit called NC Innovation, which would do this. We don't know what. We know that was definitely part of the negotiations behind closed doors. We don't know what came of it. I think that there's going to be some funding for NC Innovation, but probably not the $1.4 billion that was initially asked for. We'll see. Again, it's a good idea in principle, but taxpayers have already paid for the universities and the scholarships for the people who have come up with this research. I don't know why they have to come in for the venture capital as well.
Well, we're going to be watching very closely as that budget deal comes forward. Anna Bevan, NC Free works with a lot of businesses. Are these folks hoping that there is some deal soon, just so we know what's in the budget?
Yeah, I definitely think that anytime there is a delay in the budget, there's always a little bit of uneasiness within the business community. But I know for sure that they're watching a lot of education policy. And Donald mentioned the universal voucher program. That is something that is top on the list for sure.
As the budget negotiations have been going on, we know that there's been a lot of nothing happening on some other things. Brooke, we know that there are some other big items that are still hanging out there.
Yeah, I would say chief among them is the Parents' Bill of Rights. That's certainly something that, those who are watching education also care about this. So it's really, really exciting to see that the universal voucher is coming to fruition. It looks like that's where it's headed. But equally as important, especially given here in North Carolina that at least 75% of our students attend traditional public schools, is the necessity for a Parents' Bill of Rights. And so we here at Locke are certainly interested in seeing what happens there, but I know just every parent that lives here in the state and sends their child off to school is certainly going to benefit from something like that that more clearly articulates the rights that they have as parents to be actively involved and engaged with the discussions surrounding their children's education.
That was a bill that was passed by the General Assembly, vetoed by Governor Cooper. There are a total of 6 vetoed bills that are still hanging out there that need to be addressed, and Alex will be following that very closely. Once the General Assembly comes back, it starts taking votes on these issues. We're going to turn now from the General Assembly to the campaign trail. Yes, we're getting closer and closer to another major election year in 2024, and as we get closer to that major election, we know that Anna Bevan has been crunching some numbers about campaign finances. Tell us what you've been looking at.
Yeah, so one of the bigger questions that I have is, one, we know that elections are more and more expensive. We've seen more money come into the state. Campaigns are having to raise more money to be able to tell their story. And so what is the cost of our elections? What does it come down to? Can we see any trend lines that may exist in a cost per vote? And I have a couple of slides that I'll reference so that you guys at home can see them. This first one you see is really focused on the governor's race, and so there were not a ton of Council of State races where we could create a trend line or see one come together. But looking at the 2012, 2016, and 2020 elections, we were able to come up with a prediction. And so 2012 came out to roughly $5.04. And included in this information is just the campaign committee money. This doesn't include outside spending, just campaign committee money. And the cost per vote is based on the winner's cost per vote. And so red line means Republican, blue line means Democrat. And so 16 we get to just under $11, 2020 we get to just under $15. And if it continues in the trend that we're seeing, we're probably looking at $20 a vote. However, with the current campaign finance reporting, I think we're going to get much higher to that. I think we can probably look at like $30 to $35 a vote based on how much the candidates are pulling in right now. And so that's a big piece of the story. There's another slide that I want to point your attention to, and this slide highlights the competitive races. And so NC Free looked at 5 randomly selected competitive races in the House and the Senate in 2018, 2020, and 2022, and trying to calculate our cost per vote. And so if you look at the off year, really setting the tone in the cost per vote, the even year or the presidential year comes in and really highlights and holds that line. And so one of the reasons why we do that, or why that is, there's a thought bubble off to the side, is that there are more votes that were calculated and actually took place in 2020 than in 2018, so it brought down the cost per vote. But we're looking at 2024 potentially seeing twice as expensive in the cost per vote as in 18 and 20. And so that is just mind-blowing when we start talking about the amount of money that is spent in these races, fundraised by candidates to be able to tell their story, and spent in order to tell their story better. And so when we think about all the noise and all the voices, and the first thing that always pops in my mind is the mail that we're going to get, the Pandora ads, It's going to be everywhere, and it's going to start.
You still listen to Pandora?
I do still listen to Pandora. I've taught it years teaching it that I don't like Jack Johnson, and so I'm going to stick with that Pandora. But all that to say, there's going to be a lot of noise that the voters are going to have to sift through to figure out what they want to listen to.
Donald, when you see these numbers, what comes to mind?
A couple of things. One, are how expensive state legislative races have gotten in a ridiculous sort of way. I remember it was a very big deal when I think Chad Barefoot, when he was in the state Senate, spent something like $918,000 on his Eastern Wake district that went up into Franklin County. And that was just an astronomical number on a state Senate race. And now we have Rachel Hunt, who spent over $1 million, close to $2 million, I think, are approaching it. Sydney Batch, a few years ago when she was running for a state house seat, now a state senator, she spent over $1 million. That's incredibly expensive for a very small piece of the state. Remember, there are 120 state house districts. And so I don't know where we go in this. You know, the thing about North Carolina is we are a perennial battleground state. And it's not just that Republicans are dominant here, it's that every political group comes to live here. And so it becomes more and more expensive. I am curious about the presidential year sort of holding the line on where previous spending had been. And I don't know how to prove this, I'm sure smarter minds can, but I'm wondering if the coattail effects of presidential and U.S. Senate races sort of insulate state house races from inflationary effects. But somebody else is going to have to come up with that model because I don't know how to do it.
Sounds like something for Anna Bevan Gravely. So we barely touched the surface of your report. If people want to find more, they can find it, I'm guessing, at your website?
Yeah, you can find it on our website, ncfree.org. And then you can also book a presentation. I'll be glad to break down the numbers for you guys on your own.
Very good. Speaking of campaigns, we also learned today, before this program was recorded, that Dan Bishop, the congressman from the Charlotte area, is going to run for North Carolina Attorney General. So he'll be one of those people whose campaign finance reports Anna Bevan and others will be poring over. Also on the campaign finance front, interesting news this week involving Josh Stein, the Attorney General who is running for governor of North Carolina. Alex, what did we learn about the Stein campaign this week?
So Josh Stein, who's our Democratic Attorney General, who's running for governor, he announced, I think it was January 18th earlier this year, about 7 days into his campaign, he was scammed out of $50,000 of campaign money. It went to an anonymous source, is how it's listed on the campaign finance report.
And I think Locke's Jim Sterling was the first person to actually notice this to the public.
That's right. Jim put something out there. I think he didn't say who the campaign was, but he said, like, this is kind of a weird find that I just found as I was going through campaign finance reports. What do you guys think about this? And so anyways, it did sort of take off nationally. I think the Associated Press, maybe U.S. News, started picking this up because this is a big story. I mean, $50,000 is a ton of money. And I mean, Stein has raised a lot of money too, so maybe it's nothing to him, but in the grand scheme of things, it was the second largest transaction of his entire campaign finance report. So this is a big sum of money.
That's 9 maxed out donors, to be clear. That's what it represents.
It's a huge amount of money. And yeah, $50,000 for the Attorney General. I mean, like, part of his job is fighting scammers and stopping scammers and informing the public, like, hey, he actually has a scam number you can call. I forget what it is, but
and he highlighted it the day that he ended up getting scammed, right?
Yes, that's right. Yep, I put that.
Ironic.
Yep. So yeah, about 6 weeks later, we find out where he was actually intending to send the money to was this media group that does Democratic campaigns. So anyways, that was a very interesting story. It was interesting to me that he didn't be more forthright about this. And I don't know if he went around and told his donors, like, hey, this is something that's happening, but I know we'd never seen anything in the public and until the mid-year campaign finance report comes out in August, or maybe it was the end of July, but anyways, about 7 months later, we find out about this thing that happened 1 week into his campaign.
And it's already had an impact in the governor's race. We're going to bring up the tweet of the week now because this initial news about Josh Stein prompted a response from Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, who said, according to news reports, Democrat Josh Stein's campaign transferred $50,000 to a scammer The Mark Robinson for Governor campaign issued the statement below, talking about Stein. But then you'll see above that the response to the response. Another Republican in the race for governor, Mark Walker, after spending 25 years cheating people, plus 3 bankruptcies, tax liens, multiple foreclosures, civil judgments, unpaid property taxes, and even criminal charges on fraudulent check writing in multiple NC counties, the LG, Lieutenant Governor, knows a scam job when he sees one. Brooke, your reaction?
That was scathing. Shots fired for sure. So, we're still about 7 months away from the primary, and Walker going directly after Robinson like that, I think that might just be the first shot across the bow on that front. Of course, right now, according to our polling, Robinson is the clear front runner among likely GOP voters, but Walker is next behind him, and then Falwell, and we will continue to poll some other candidates as they announce their entrance into the race. So I think that this is one of those accusations that the North Carolina political community and voters should actually be watching and finding out, is there more to come, and if so, what does that look like, and does that change the dynamics of this race? To date, Robinson has been able to say a lot of things from both the pulpit, at churches, as well as other campaign events that have certainly raised some eyebrows, but it doesn't seem to have hurt his numbers among the likely GOP electorate. So is this something else, though? Is this different, especially given Robinson going after Stein for fiscal management or mismanagement, and then Walker going after Robinson for something very similar? So we'll see how that plays out.
It's going to be very interesting. I had a chance to talk about Walker's response to Robinson's response to Stein on a radio show this week at Henry Hinton's Talk of the Town. Henry had been talking about the issue all morning. He said he invited the former Congressman Mark Walker on his show. Walker deferred, but said he would be issuing more information tied to what he tweeted on Monday. So we'll have to be watching out for that. Well, let's turn now to a topic that's of national interest. We know that for the entire length of the history of this country, there has been a debate about what is American conservatism versus European traditional conservatism. Certainly this has been an issue in the post-World War II era, and there's been a lot of debate about who's a conservative, who's not a conservative, what is part of conservatism. Well, there's been a major development on that front in recent weeks, and that is a new statement of principles for something called Freedom Conservatism. And one of the initial signers of that statement is our own Locke CEO, Donald Bryson. Freedom Conservatism, why is it something you wanted to support?
Well, I think it's important that we talk about what conservatism is. Conservatism, the root word is conserve. We're going to have a little vocabulary lesson for a second. But the root word is conserve. So what are we trying to conserve?
And while you are talking, we are seeing
right.
some of the principles that are in
right.
that statement of principles.
And I think that's really great. And so the point is, what are we actually trying to conserve? The traditional American conservatism, which you were alluding to, is actually born out of sort of British classical liberalism, which the root word for liberal is not, what we think of today's progressive and illiberalism, but that comes from the Latin term for liberty, libertas. And so the idea is we need to conserve freedom. We need to conserve human liberty, individual liberty. And there's been a lot of confusion in American politics, particularly on the right, about what conservatism is. And there's a lot of talk about making conservatism relevant. Okay, I am all for making conservatism relevant, but I don't think that means that we accede to arguments being made from the left that the government, whether that's state or federal, becomes more relevant in our lives. And conservatives aren't all about saying no. And as much as I like Senator Jesse Helms, and he was Senator No, right? We don't say no to everything. What are conservatives for? Well, we're for free speech. We're for free enterprise. We're for individual rights. We're for balanced budgets, by the way, Congress. Thank you very much. We're for fiscal discipline, and we're for sort of democratic republicanism underpinned by Republican virtue. And so this statement of principles was put out. I think at the time that I signed it, it came out, there were about 70 national leaders that had signed it. I think the list is up over 100 now, and they're still taking on signatories. But I think it's important that conservatives talk about what we're actually trying to do, what our tradition is, and how we see public policy going forward, and that individual liberty still is relevant in American politics.
Mm-hmm. You were one of the initial signers when this was first unveiled. A person who signed shortly afterward, right after it became public, was Brooke Medina. Why did you decide that freedom conservatism was important?
Because after watching what's been going on here on the right and being a participant in some of these intellectual exchanges about really how we define conservatism and the battle between what some are calling common good capitalism or national conservatism versus those that are maybe more libertarian leaning or free market oriented, it's important to establish maybe some guardrails as to how we do understand the American concept of ordered liberty and what that means in our context when you have those who subscribe to national conservatism calling for more industrial policy and more what I would call left-leaning policies that look more like Elizabeth Warren than they do Ronald Reagan, then I think there's a time for a healthy, robust debate and conversation. And I'm glad to be a part of that conversation and also just follow some of the intellectual forebears that we have that say you don't have to pit markets against morality. You don't have to be either pro-capitalism or pro-family. These things lift one another up. And so conservatism isn't just reduced to what we think about markets. It's about the people that fuel those markets. It's about the heart of human beings and human nature. And I think that that has left the conversation. And so national conservatives oftentimes will wag their fingers at those more freedom type conservatives and try to reduce it all to it just being a debate about the markets, but it's not. It's about individual liberties and whether or not people have the right to control their own destiny.
NC Free, not necessarily a conservative group. You have people from various perspectives, but this has to be an interesting debate to the people who are working with your group.
Absolutely. I think that's something that we're watching is how's this conversation between national conservatism and freedom conservatism, like how is that going to play out when it comes down to elected officials, when it comes down to policy that gets passed, and really ultimately the conversation about what is the role of government. And then also what are policies that are being promoted even within the business community that might look like using government better than the other guys? And I think that's something that we want to be very careful about.
This is not something that necessarily plays out on a day-to-day basis at the General Assembly, but I'm guessing that sometimes you hear sort of these philosophical debates that pit people who might be considered nat cons and free cons.
Well, it's a big debate sometimes, especially with regard to state spending. And some of that varies year to year, but traditionally, at least in my time covering this stuff, the Senate has been more on the freedom spend less side, and the House has a bunch of spending projects that they want to spend on. And this year that might have changed a little bit depending on what you look at, but yeah, there definitely are some of those dynamics even at the state government level. Well,
it's an interesting topic. It's certainly one we'll be following in future episodes of the Debrief, talking about philosophy, but now we're going to change to a topic I did not expect to be talking about on the Debrief. It wasn't on my bingo card several weeks ago, but this has been a national phenomenon and certainly deserves some mention, and that is Barbie. The classic, iconic doll now is the subject of a movie, and it's generated some hubbub, including a lot of talk among the political chattering classes. Brooke, I know you were very interested in the Barbie movie. What should we know about it?
Ooh. Very interested is a nice way to put it. I was ecstatic about it, very excited. Grew up playing with Barbies, and just, could not wait. First off, hats off to their marketing campaign because they took this world by storm and did excellent execution of that. I mean, you see Barbie memes everywhere, discussion about it. But I would argue that this is also a philosophical discussion. So we are pivoting from one to the other. And this has to do, though, with dynamics between men and women. And I think that was actually what spurred some of the pushback from the likes of Ben Shapiro, for example. And he said that this movie was very woke and goes after the patriarchy, whatever that is, kind of thing. But the way I saw it was that this was a really healthy discussion that represented the experience of a lot of women, myself included. I went with a number of other women as well as some men to the movie. Everyone enjoyed it, but it
we see a crowd right there enjoying it.
There we go. Yeah. I love that cowboy hat. That's great. So the discussion, though, I would say one of them that it centered around was just the importance of not just pitting men against women. It's not all about, there being a patriarchy, or in Barbie land, for example, a matriarchy. That doesn't work when we pit one against the other, but rather that, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so we need to work together, and there should be some reconciliation between the genders. But Greta Gerwig, the producer of this, her target audience was women that grew up playing with Barbies. And so I think she really resonated with that audience. And so I'm really happy the movie came out. I do think it's definitely for older teens and adults. I don't think it's necessarily one for young children. But the themes in it certainly resonate with a lot of women, and I'm here for it.
Anna Bevan, your thoughts?
I've been fighting wearing pink ever since I saw it. I found out I had a lot of pink in my wardrobe for someone who really likes neutrals and dark colors. But I couldn't agree with Brooke more. I was amazed by the movie. I think they did, part of their marketing plan was to not really tell you the full plot. So you didn't really know what you were walking into. So it was either going to be awesome or awful. There was going to be no middle ground. And the part that stood out to me the most was really how the set was built, like literally built. There wasn't CGI. It was pieces of the Barbie houses were built on purpose. So you felt like you were watching a fantasy land. It wasn't supposed to feel realistic. And so if that's how you started the entire movie, you kept that the entire time. And so when they went into the real world and then came back into Barbie land, you felt the friction that existed between the two spaces. And with that, I think as viewers, we got a chance to be a little more introspective and really question ourselves. And so we saw things that maybe we identified with or that didn't really sit well, and we didn't know why it didn't sit well. And so I think the big theme, the themes that Brooke hit on, definitely, you left the film wondering, how do I fit into this? Like, what is my observation? What can I do with this information that I've found out? And so it was a little more like a call to action than I think a massive attack on men, by all means, yeah.
Sounds thought-provoking, not just
Definitely.
a chance to sit and shovel down popcorn.
Exactly.
Alex, what are folks in your age group talking about in terms of Barbie?
I haven't seen the movie yet, so I can't give my opinion on it, but I have seen the same sort of polarization amongst my friends who are very apolitical. They don't care about this philosophy or political mumbo jumbo, but no, they've been very polarized on the movie. Some people go and they think it's one of the best movies they've ever seen, and some people go and they literally tell their friends, you should not watch that movie. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know if that's just my age group or why it was so polarizing, but we've seen in the political spaces it's been polarizing too, which I think is interesting because I've heard all kinds of different opinions on it.
Yeah, worthy of discussing on the debrief even.
Well, I think Greta Gerwig, again, she taps into this moral imagination that if you're just looking at this movie on the surface and you hear some of these words that are political, like patriarchy, and it's like almost feminist sounding manifesto, you are inclined to think, oh, this is a very political movie, and I'm very offended now. But when you look beneath the surface and you just kind of let your imagination explore what it would be like in Barbie land, and in this context, I think you find that there's actually a lot of exciting themes to explore, and the end of it is, like I said, it's uplifting. To me, it's one about reconciliation and men and women working together well.
Excellent. Any Barbies in the Bryson household?
No, actually, neither of my daughters play with Barbie, and that's not really a choice that I've made. They just are uninterested. I'm not even sure they know that this movie exists, but they are pretty salty that I've not taken them to the Super Mario Brothers movie this summer, and so that's really where their energy lies right now.
Well, perhaps we'll talk about that in a future episode if there are interesting political themes about running around in the Super Mario Kart, or maybe we could bring back Donkey Kong or Space Invaders for old guys like me.
Absolutely.
Well, that's all the time we have on this week's episode of The Debrief. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for joining us and offering their expert insights. Thank you for watching. We hope you'll like the episode, subscribe, do all the good things to talk about how you like The Debrief. And we hope that you will tune in to carolinajournal.com throughout the day for all of the latest news on politics and public policy in North Carolina. Please join us again next week for another edition of The Debrief.